For most of the 20th century, the story of Jewish ancestry rested on a simple, powerful assumption. A people scattered across the globe by conquest and exile, from Rome to Persia to Poland, had somehow preserved one continuous, unbroken bloodline stretching back to ancient Israel, maintained faithfully through 2,000 years of diaspora by strict religious and cultural boundaries that kept the community genetically sealed off from everyone around. Scientists have now tested that assumption directly against the genome itself, tracing two separate genetic threads running through Jewish history rather than one single unified line. And those two threads tell almost completely different stories. The male line traces back to the ancient Levant with remarkable measurable consistency across communities separated by continents and centuries. The female line reveals something else entirely, a pattern of ongoing, repeated mixing with local populations across Europe that the simple, unified story never actually accounted for. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how geneticists uncovered this hidden split, tracing it through decades of published research, and what it actually reveals about how identity survives and quietly changes across 2,000 years of displacement. If that kind of layered history interests you, go ahead and subscribe, because we're about to walk through exactly how scientists figured this out piece by piece. To understand why this split matters so much, you first need to understand what assumption it actually overturned, and how deeply that assumption had settled into both popular understanding and academic scholarship. For generations, both popular understanding and a good deal of early scholarship treated Jewish communities, scattered from Yemen to Ukraine, from Morocco to Poland, as descendants of a single ancestral population that had left the Levant roughly 2,000 years ago and then largely stopped mixing with the populations surrounding them afterward, preserved almost like a genetic time capsule through strict religious endogamy maintained across dozens of generations. This wasn't an unreasonable starting assumption by any means, and it deserves to be understood on its own terms rather than dismissed outright as naive. Jewish law and custom did actively discourage marriage outside the community for most of this history, and if that separation held as firmly and as completely as tradition often implied, you would genuinely expect the genetics of Jewish communities in wildly different parts of the world to still resemble each other, and to still resemble populations from the ancient Middle East, more than they resembled the host populations they had physically lived alongside for hundreds of years. Testing that idea directly, rather than simply assuming it was true and repeating it across generations, required something scholars simply didn't have access to for most of the 20th century, the actual ability to read the genome itself rather than relying purely on historical texts, oral traditions, religious records, and physical appearance, all of which can be shaped, edited, or quietly reinterpreted by the very communities trying to preserve their own story. That changed once population geneticists gained the tools to trace two entirely separate genetic lines running through any population. The Y chromosome passed from father to son with only rare, slow mutations accumulating along the way, and mitochondrial DNA passed from mother to child, tracing the maternal line back through countless generations independently of anything happening on the paternal side. Because these two genetic threads follow completely independent paths of inheritance, never crossing or blending with one another the way the rest of the genome constantly does, comparing them directly offers something historical documents alone never could: a genuinely independent way to check whether the paternal and maternal sides of a population's history actually match each other, or whether they quietly diverged at some point without anyone noticing or writing it down. If discovering that scientists could finally test a 2,000-year-old assumption about ancestry using nothing but a blood sample sounds like the kind of story worth following closely, that's exactly why it helps to subscribe right now, because the paternal side of this story held up better than almost anyone expected. In 2000, geneticist Michael Hammer led a study examining the Y chromosomes of men from the Kohanim, a hereditary Jewish priestly caste whose members, according to tradition, trace an unbroken paternal line back to a single ancestor, Aaron, brother of Moses, roughly 3,000 years ago, with priestly status passed down strictly from father to son ever since across dozens of generations. Testing men who identified as Kohanim across genetically and geographically separated Jewish communities, including groups that had lived apart from one another for centuries, with essentially no contact or communication at all, Hammer's team found a strikingly consistent Y chromosome signature, one shared far more frequently among self-identified Kohanim than among the general Jewish population sampled alongside them later, dubbed the Cohen modal haplotype, in recognition of exactly what it appeared to represent. Follow-up research through the 2000s, including additional work published by Hammer's team in 2009, expanding the original sample considerably, reinforced this finding further, and broader surveys of Y chromosome diversity across diverse Jewish diaspora communities, Ashkenazi communities scattered across Europe, Sephardi communities descended from Iberia, And Mizrahi communities from the Middle East and North Africa consistently found stronger genetic similarity to each other and to non-Jewish Middle Eastern populations like Palestinians, Druze, and Bedouin than to the European or North African populations. These same communities had lived alongside for centuries, sometimes over 1,000 years. Along the paternal line, in other words, the old story held up remarkably well under direct genetic scrutiny. Whatever else happened over 2,000 years of dispersal, war, expulsion, and resettlement, something close to a genuinely continuous male lineage connecting these far-flung communities back to the ancient Near East appeared to survive intact, detectable in the genome centuries later. If the idea that a single Y chromosome signature could trace an unbroken paternal thread across multiple Jewish communities, separated by continents and centuries, sounds like exactly the kind of genetic detective work worth understanding in full, that's exactly why it helps to subscribe. Because the maternal side of the story took a dramatically different turn. The first hints that something didn't quite match came in 2002, when geneticist Mark Thomas and colleagues compared Y chromosome diversity directly against mitochondrial DNA diversity across 8 geographically separated Jewish communities, scattered across different continents and different centuries of separate settlement history. The mismatch was immediate and striking, visible the moment the two data sets were placed side by side. Along the maternal line, researchers identified at least 8 distinct common founder lineages, each representing more than 10% of a given community's mitochondrial DNA on its own, with almost no meaningful overlap between different communities' founder lineages, meaning each community's maternal ancestry looked genuinely distinct from the others. Along the paternal line, by contrast, several of these same communities showed remarkably little genetic differentiation from the non-Jewish populations they lived among, a pattern that, on the maternal side at least, simply didn't exist. The male line and the female line, in other words, were already telling two noticeably different stories well before anyone had fully mapped out where those specific maternal lineages had actually originated from in the first place. That mapping came in 2006, when Doron Behar led a large-scale study analyzing mitochondrial DNA from more than 11,000 samples across 67 populations worldwide, specifically designed to trace the maternal ancestry of Ashkenazi Jewish communities across Europe in far greater detail than any previous study had managed. The results were striking on their own terms, striking enough to make international headlines at the time. Roughly 40% of the entire Ashkenazi Jewish population's maternal lineage traced back to just 4 founding women, an extraordinarily small number of maternal ancestors, accounting for such a disproportionately large share of an entire diaspora community's genetic history, spanning millions of people alive today across dozens of countries. At the time, Behar's team proposed that these 4 founding lineages likely originated in the Middle East roughly 2,100 years ago, describing them in the paper itself as tracing back to what they called a Hebrew or Levantine mitochondrial DNA pool. For a moment, it genuinely looked like the maternal line might actually confirm the same clean, continuous story the Y chromosome evidence had already suggested a few years earlier, closing the loop on the old assumption rather than complicating it further, exactly as many researchers in the field had quietly hoped it would. If the idea of an entire diaspora population's maternal ancestry narrowing down to just 4 women sounds like exactly the kind of statistic that deserves a second, more careful look before accepting it at face value. That's exactly why it helps to subscribe, because a second, more careful look is precisely what happened next. In 2013, geneticist Marta Costa led a considerably more detailed re-examination of these same 4 founding maternal lineages, drawing on a far larger and more geographically comprehensive comparison dataset, spanning European populations across dozens of countries that simply hadn't been available or hadn't been analyzed with the same level of resolution back in 2006. The revised picture that emerged directly overturned Behar's earlier interpretation, despite drawing on much of the same underlying genetic material. Rather than tracing it primarily back to an ancient Levantine source carried faithfully across 2 millennia, Costa's team found that the great majority of these founding Ashkenazi maternal lineages actually originated through repeated, separate admixture events happening locally within Europe itself, at different points across the centuries rather than all at once. This meant that local European women had been absorbed into Ashkenazi Jewish communities on multiple distinct occasions, across a long stretch of history, spanning many centuries in many different regions, not through a single ancient migration of Levantine mothers whose lineage had then been preserved unbroken ever since, the way the 2006 study had originally proposed. The maternal line, once properly traced with better tools and a broader comparative dataset, revealed a genuinely different history than the one initially proposed just 7 years earlier, one shaped repeatedly by intermarriage and conversion rather than uninterrupted descent from the ancient Near East, A conclusion later research studying medieval Jewish remains directly from European burial sites has continued to find broadly consistent with the genetic patterns preserved in ancient DNA as well. Put the paternal and maternal findings side by side, and considerably more complicated, more genuinely, human picture starts to emerge than the simple, unbroken bloodline story most people grew up hearing repeated as settled fact. The male line, largely preserved through religious and social structures that kept paternal lineage central to Jewish identity, inheritance, and religious status across generations, shows real, measurable continuity reaching back toward the ancient Levant across multiple independently settled diaspora communities separated by continents and centuries of separate history. The female line shows something else entirely, a pattern. The consistency with local women repeatedly joining these communities, likely through marriage and religious conversion, across many centuries and in many different regions of Europe, then having their own maternal lineages absorbed permanently into the community's genetic record going forward, generation after generation. This isn't a story about the paternal evidence being right and the maternal evidence being wrong, or one side of the family tree simply overruling the other. It's a story about two authentically different historical processes operating side by side within the exact same communities across the exact same centuries, leaving two genuinely different genetic signatures behind for scientists to eventually untangle and compare centuries later, once the right tools finally exist to do so properly. There's a genuinely interesting side note buried inside the Y chromosome research too, worth pausing on because it shows this entire field of study correcting itself in exactly the way careful, honest science is actually supposed to work when new evidence comes in. Researchers studying the Levites, another hereditary Jewish lineage tied to the ancient tribe of Levi and traditionally responsible for supporting temple worship and religious duties, found that roughly half of Ashkenazi Levites carried a Y chromosome haplogroup called R1A1, a lineage extremely common across Eastern Europe and largely absent from populations in the ancient Near East, which initially raised a real, genuinely uncomfortable question for researchers studying this specific lineage. Could this particular branch of Levite ancestry actually trace to a European or even a Khazarian origin rather than a Near Eastern one, directly at odds with the Levites' own traditional claim to an unbroken paternal line reaching back to ancient Israel? More detailed follow-up sequencing work, published in 2013, eventually identified a specific sub-branch within that broader R1A haplogroup, labeled M582, carried specifically by these Levite lineages. That traces back convincingly to a Near Eastern origin predating the diaspora after all, resolving what had briefly looked like a genuine crack in the paternal continuity story into something considerably more consistent with it. Instead, once researcher S had the tools to look closely enough at exactly which branch of a shared, broader haplogroup these particular men actually carried, this entire body of research also directly tested and firmly closed the door on 1OF, the most persistent alternative theories about Jewish ancestry circulating in popular discussion for decades. The idea that Ashkenazi Jewish communities descend primarily from the Khazars, a Turkic-speaking people who ruled a powerful kingdom north of the Caucasus roughly 1,000 years ago, and are historically known to have converted to Judaism at the level of their ruling elite, a theory popularized in books aimed at a general audience long before genetic testing could actually weigh in on the question directly. In 2013, Behar led a separate genome-wide study specifically designed to test this hypothesis head-on, assembling one of the largest genetic datasets ever compiled for this purpose, more than 1,700 samples spanning over 100 Jewish and non-Jewish populations worldwide, including 261 samples drawn specifically from populations across the Caucasus region most closely associated with the historical Khazar territory, samples that had never previously been analyzed directly alongside Ashkenazi Jewish genetic data in this way. The results were unambiguous and left little room for alternative interpretation. Ashkenazi Jewish populations showed no particular genetic similarity to Caucasus populations whatsoever, closing the door on the Khazar hypothesis as a meaningful explanation for Ashkenazi origins, and reinforcing instead the dual Middle Eastern and European ancestry pattern that the paternal and maternal research had already independently pointed toward through completely separate lines of evidence. If watching one popular alternative theory get directly tested and firmly ruled out by an enormous genetic dataset is the kind of scientific closure that satisfies you as much as it satisfies me, go ahead and subscribe, because pulling every one of these threads together tells a genuinely different story than the one most people grew up hearing. Taken as a whole, this body of research doesn't so much disprove the idea of shared Jewish ancestry as it complicates and deepens it considerably, replacing a simple, singular story with a genuinely richer two-part one. The paternal line really does connect diverse, geographically scattered Jewish communities back toward a shared Near Eastern origin, a genuine, measurable thread of continuity running underneath centuries of dispersal, exile, expulsion, and displacement across 3 separate continents. But the maternal line tells a story of ongoing local integration instead, communities absorbing new members and new maternal lineages again and again across the centuries, in ways that pure oral tradition and religious law never fully documented and perhaps never fully acknowledged in the historical record at all, since the religious and social framework organizing these communities was itself built primarily around paternal descent and inheritance. Neither thread alone gives you the complete picture, and relying on just one, the way most popular retellings of Jewish history effectively did for generations, leaves out fully half of the actual story. Only tracing both simultaneously and comparing what each one says on its own terms, without assuming they must agree, reveals the actual considerably more textured history sitting underneath a story that had been simplified for generations into something far cleaner and more uniform than the underlying biology ever actually was. If the idea that a community's identity could be preserved through one line of descent while quietly transforming through the other, for centuries, without anyone formally documenting it, sounds like exactly the kind of hidden historical pattern worth understanding fully. That's exactly why it helps to subscribe. Because the closing, picture this research, paints applies well beyond just one population. Perhaps the most important lesson embedded in all of this research has less to do with any single population and more to do with how deeply the maternal and paternal lines of any group's history can diverge from each other without anyone noticing at all. Simply because, for most of human history, nobody actually had the tools needed to trace them separately and compare notes directly. A community's identity can be maintained with genuine, remarkable consistency along one line of descent, carefully preserved through religious law, inheritance customs, and social structure, while quietly, repeatedly changing along the other line entirely, absorbing new members generation after generation through processes nobody bothered to formally record. And from the outside, using only religious record-keeping, oral tradition, or physical appearance, the tools available to virtually every historian working before the genomic era ever began, there was never any reliable way to tell the difference between the two, since both processes could produce a community that looked, felt, and understood itself as a single, continuous people, regardless of what was actually happening underneath, generation after generation, on the maternal side specifically. And that leaves us with a genuinely striking thought to close on. Every single person carrying this dual inheritance today is walking around with 2 separate, independently verifiable timelines written directly into their own cells. One tracing a real, resilient, paternal continuity back toward the ancient Levant across 2,000 years of dispersal, war, and resettlement, and another quietly, recording centuries of local women joining those same communities from the outside, generation after generation, largely unrecorded by the religious and cultural institutions built specifically to preserve identity in the first place. History remembers the story communities chose to tell about themselves, the version passed down through religious texts, family names, and inherited status. DNA, it turns out, was always quietly keeping its own separate, considerably more complicated record running in parallel the entire time, patient enough to wait 2,000 years for the right tools to finally come along and actually read it properly. It's worth sitting with what this actually means for how identity itself gets built and quietly maintained over vast stretches of time, because the pattern uncovered here likely isn't unique to any single population or any single religious tradition. Wherever a community maintains strong paternal continuity through religious law, inheritance, or social custom, while remaining more genuinely open to outside integration on the maternal side, whether through conversion, intermarriage, or simple everyday contact between neighbors living side by side for generations, you'd expect to find exactly this kind of quiet divergence between the 2 genetic threads, hiding in plain sight for generation after generation, until someone finally thinks to trace both lines separately and lay the results directly side by side.